The first time they tried to buy my land, they showed up with muffins. I'm serious, blueberry muffins in a white bakery box like we were neighbors meeting for coffee instead of a couple of developers trying to erase my home off a map. And looking back now, that might have been the moment I should have realized these people were dangerous, because anybody smiling that hard while offering you six figures for something you already said wasn't for sale, well, they're usually not planning to take no for an answer. My name's Wade Mercer, and up until about 2 years ago, my biggest concern in life was whether the peach trees behind my barn were going to survive another dry Georgia summer. My place sat just outside Belhaven, about 40 minutes north of Atlanta, 12 acres of flat old family land my grandfather bought after coming home from World War II. Nothing fancy about it. White farmhouse, rusty tin roof that popped loud during rainstorms, a wraparound porch held together by more prayers than nails, and a hand-dug well sitting behind the shed that had somehow outlived 3 generations of stubborn Mercers. My granddad used to say that well had more loyalty than most people. Treat the land right, he'd tell me, and it remembers. Funny thing is, I used to laugh when he said stuff like that. Then all this happened, and now I'm not laughing anymore. See, Belhaven used to be one of those towns where everybody knew your truck before they knew your name. Folks waved at each other at red lights. High school football was basically religion, and nobody locked their doors unless they had teenage sons sneaking out at night. But then Atlanta started growing outward like mold on bread, and suddenly developers came sniffing around every patch of dirt they could find. First came the chain stores, then the luxury apartments, then the giant signs with smiling fake families standing in front of houses nobody from Belhaven could actually afford. Before long, every piece of land around mine got bought up by a company called Alder Ridge Development. They promised jobs, growth, opportunity, all the usual words rich people use right before they bulldoze something old. I remember the first time I met Gavin Shaw. Tall guy, expensive watch, teeth so white they looked radioactive. He stepped out of a black SUV wearing boots so clean I don't think they'd ever touched mud in their life. "Mr. Mercer," he said, holding out his hand like a politician at a county fair, "you're sitting on the final piece of a very exciting future." I looked past him at the line of survey flags stuck all over the neighboring fields and said, "That future looks loud." He laughed like I'd told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Then he handed me an offer sheet. Triple market value. Enough money to buy a nicer house somewhere else and still have enough left over to coast the rest of my life. And I'll admit, for maybe half a second, I thought about it. Not because I wanted to leave, but because life had been hard since my wife passed. Quiet house, empty chair at the dinner table, too much land for one man pushing 60 to take care of alone. But then I looked over at the old oak tree near the fence line where my daughter carved her initials when she was 12, and I realized something these developers never understand. Some places stop being property after enough memories happen there. They become part of you. I handed Gavin the paper back and said, "Appreciate the offer, but this land's not for sale." His smile stayed on his face, but it changed shape a little. You ever see somebody smile without warmth behind it? Like a dog showing teeth before it bites? That's what it looked like. "Everybody has a number," he said calmly. "Not everybody," I told him. He nodded slow, like he was humoring a child. "Well," he said, climbing back into his SUV, "I think eventually you'll come around." And that right there, that was the first thing that kept me awake at night. Not the money, not the construction, the confidence in his voice. Like the decision had already been made for me, and I just didn't know it yet. About 2 weeks later, the blasting started. At first it sounded distant, like thunder rolling under the ground, but every day it got closer. Windows rattled. Dishes shook in the cabinets. Even my bloodhound Rufus started hiding under the porch every afternoon around 3 o'clock when the dynamite charges went off. Then one morning I turned on the kitchen faucet and the water came out brown. Not muddy exactly, more like coffee with too much cream in it. I stared at it for a long second, thinking maybe a pipe rusted somewhere. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't random. Because sometimes your gut notices danger before your brain catches up. And standing there in that old kitchen, holding a glass full of dirty water from a well that had run clean since 1948, I had the strange feeling somebody had just declared war on me without saying the words out loud. Now, if you've lived out in the country long enough, you learn not to panic over one bad day of water. Wells can get stirred up after heavy rain, Pipes clog, sediment shifts around underground. There's usually an explanation. So at first, I tried talking myself out of what I already suspected. But then the next morning the water came out darker. By the third day it smelled like wet concrete. And by the end of the week, even Rufus wouldn't drink it. I called Alder Ridge and got bounced around through 3 receptionists before Gavin finally picked up. You could hear construction equipment roaring in the background like he wanted me to hear it. "Wade," he said, sounding almost amused. "Old wells are unpredictable. Happens all the time." "Funny," I told him. "This one stayed predictable for 73 years until y'all started blowing holes in the earth next door." There was a little pause. Then he sighed the way people do when they're pretending to be patient. "Look, progress comes with adjustments. Maybe this is a good time to reconsider the offer." That word stuck with me after we hung up. Progress. People like Gavin always use that word like it gives them permission to crush whatever's standing in front of them. A few days later, I hired a well specialist named Curtis Hale. Older guy, sunburned neck, cigarette voice, drove a truck held together by duct tape and spite. He spent half a day checking pumps, pressure lines, sediment filters, all of it. Finally, he climbed out of the well housing, wiping sweat off his forehead, and said, "Your well's healthy." "Then why's my water look like swamp soup?" He looked toward the construction site beyond the trees where another blast shook the ground hard enough to rattle my porch swing. "Because somebody over there's messing with the aquifer." Curtis explained that underground water systems are delicate, especially around older hand-dug wells. Too much blasting, too much excavation, and you can redirect sediment straight into the water flow. "Can it be fixed?" I asked. He shrugged slowly. "Depends if they stop." But they didn't stop. If anything, the construction got more aggressive after that. More trucks, more drilling, more explosions. And right around then, weird little things started happening too. Fence posts knocked over during the night. Trash blowing into my pasture from the construction site. Workers parking equipment partly on my property line like they were testing how much they could get away with. One afternoon, I caught 2 subcontractors eating lunch under my pecan tree. I walked over and asked if they realized they were sitting on private property. One of them smirked and said, "Won't matter much longer." That sentence sat in my chest like a rock, because at that point it wasn't really about land anymore. It was about pressure. They wanted me uncomfortable, tired, isolated, easier to move. And truthfully, there were nights it almost worked. My daughter Emily called constantly begging me to leave. "Dad, these people have money," she said. "People with money don't lose." But she didn't understand. Or maybe she understood too well. See, after my wife Caroline died from cancer, this house became the last place where I still felt close to her. Every creaky floorboard, every crooked cabinet she complained about for 20 years but never fixed, every mark on the wall from measuring Emily's height growing up, leaving felt like burying her all over again. So I stayed. Then one morning I turned on the faucet and nothing came out. Not brown water, not black water, nothing. Just a dry metallic cough from the pipes. I remember standing there frozen, listening to that empty, sputtering sound echo through the kitchen. People who've never lived on well water probably won't understand this, but when your well dies, it doesn't just feel inconvenient. It feels personal, like your home itself has stopped breathing. Curtis came back out that afternoon, and within 10 minutes his entire mood changed. He walked me past the tree line behind my property where runoff from the construction site drained downhill toward the underground recharge area feeding my well. Somebody had dumped piles of filled dirt, broken concrete, insulation scraps, and crushed debris directly into the drainage path. Fresh tire tracks covered everything. Curtis just stared for a second before muttering, "Those sons of bitches." I took photos from every angle. Bag samples. Marked tire impressions. Then I drove straight to Alder Ridge's temporary office trailer sitting near the construction entrance. Gavin was inside with 2 men in polos studying blueprints spread across a folding table. He looked irritated the second he saw me. "You can't just walk in here," he said. I threw the photos down in front of him. "You dumped debris into my water recharge zone." One of the other men glanced at the pictures and immediately looked nervous, but Gavin barely blinked. "Construction material gets moved around," he said casually. "That's not construction material," I snapped. "That's illegal dumping." Gavin leaned back in his chair, calm as a man ordering lunch. "Mr. Mercer, with all due respect, Your property is becoming an obstacle to a regional development project that's bringing significant economic opportunity to this county. I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because I suddenly understood exactly who I was dealing with. So this is punishment? I asked him. No, he said smoothly. This is reality. You can either adapt to change or get buried under it. I still remember the silence after that. One of the men near him looked down at his boots like he didn't want to be part of the conversation anymore. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw the truth plain as day. Gavin genuinely believed he was untouchable. Guys like him spend so much time winning that eventually they stop imagining consequences. That ended up being his biggest mistake. Because later that night, Emily drove down from Chattanooga after I finally admitted how bad things had gotten. We sat on the porch drinking warm beer while cicadas screamed through the trees and construction lights glowed in the distance like some invading army camped outside our home. You need a lawyer, she said finally. Lawyers cost money. So does losing everything. I didn't answer right away. I just stared out at the dark pasture where my grandfather used to walk every evening before supper. Then Emily said something that hit me harder than anything else. Dad, if Mom were here, do you really think she'd let these people scare you off? And just like that, the fear turned into anger. Clean, focused anger. The kind that steadies your hands instead of shaking them. The next morning, I called an environmental attorney named Denise Rollins. Former state prosecutor, sharp as barbed wire, didn't smile much unless somebody was getting exposed in court. She came out to inspect the property herself. Walked the drainage area, studied the debris piles, tested the dead well, listened quietly while I explained everything from the beginning. When I finished, she looked toward the construction site and said, "They got arrogant." Meaning they stopped hiding what they were doing. Denise filed an injunction request within 48 hours. Property damage, groundwater interference, environmental contamination, harassment. The whole thing. Alder Ridge responded immediately with expensive attorneys and polished statements claiming they had followed all applicable regulations. But then county inspectors showed up, and that's when things really started unraveling. Because the moment officials started digging around the site, they found a whole lot more than what happened to my well. And believe me, when the truth finally surfaced, even I wasn't ready for how ugly this thing was about to get. The county inspectors were supposed to be there for one afternoon. That was the original plan. Check the runoff area, verify the complaints, maybe issue a warning if Alder Ridge had crossed a line somewhere. Instead, they stayed almost 3 weeks. And every single day after that, more state vehicles kept showing up. Environmental officers, water management people, soil specialists. At one point, there were so many government trucks parked near the construction entrance, it looked like somebody was filming a disaster movie. The first major problem they uncovered was buried waste. Not construction scraps tossed around accidentally. I mean actual hidden disposal pits. Concrete slurry, insulation foam, treated lumber, chemical containers, diesel residue, all shoved into low wetland areas surrounding the development site to avoid paying proper disposal fees. One inspector told Denise privately that somebody inside Alder Ridge must have assumed nobody would notice because most of the land had already been cleared flat. But wetlands remember everything. Water moves where it's always moved, and eventually it carries the truth with it. Turns out the debris blocking my recharge zone was just one small piece of a much bigger operation. Once the state got involved, things escalated fast. The county issued an immediate stop work order. Daily fines started piling up. Investors got nervous. Local news stations started circling like vultures. And suddenly Belhaven split right down the middle. Some people supported me. Others blamed me for shutting down the biggest development project the town had seen in decades. One morning, I walked into Miller's Diner, and the whole room went quiet for about 3 seconds. You ever experienced that? Forks stopping halfway to mouths, coffee cups freezing midair, everybody pretending they weren't just talking about you. Earl Miller, who'd known me since high school, poured my coffee and muttered, "Town says you cost us 200 jobs." I took a sip and said, "Town should ask why the developers poisoned groundwater instead." Earl nodded once. Fair point. But not everybody saw it that way. Somebody spray-painted "sell out" or "get out" across my barn one night. Another time, I found roofing nails scattered across my driveway. Even Emily got harassed online after local articles mentioned our family by name. That part honestly surprised me more than anything. Amazing how fast people will side with money if they think a piece of it might eventually trickle down to them. Meanwhile, Gavin disappeared completely from public view. No interviews. No statements. Nothing. Denise said that usually men attorneys were trying to keep their client from making things worse. But about a month before the hearing, he finally showed up at my property unannounced. Same black SUV. Same polished boots. Only this time he looked tired. Thinner somehow. Like stress had finally started chewing through the edges of him. I was repairing fence wire when he walked over. Quite a mess this turned into, he said. I kept working. Sure did. He stood there awkwardly for a second before lowering his voice. You know, this doesn't have to keep going. I laughed under my breath. That right. The company's prepared to settle. You mean buy me out? Generously. I stuck the pliers in my back pocket and finally looked at him. You still don't get it. His jaw tightened a little. Mr. Mercer, developments like this are inevitable. Towns grow. People move in. Progress happens whether you like it or not. Maybe, I said. But poisoning somebody's land because they told you no? That ain't progress. That's cowardice. For a second, the mask slipped. Real anger flashed across his face. You think you're some kind of hero, he snapped. You're a stubborn old man standing in the way of an economy this town desperately needs. And you're a man who thought money made him immune to consequences. We just stared at each other after that, hot Georgia wind moving through the grass between us. Finally, he shook his head slowly and walked back toward the SUV. Right before getting inside, he stopped and said something I still think about sometimes. When this town stops growing, he said, people like you always get left behind. Then he drove away. Truth is, part of me wondered if he was right. Not about the corruption, not about the land, but about the bigger picture. Small towns are changing everywhere. Farms disappear. Forests become subdivisions. Old families cash out because taxes rise too high to survive. Maybe Belhaven was always heading this direction no matter what happened to me. Maybe I was just the speed bump they hit on the way there. But then the court date came, and suddenly none of that philosophical stuff mattered anymore. Because facts matter in court. And Alder Ridge had buried themselves in facts. Their own internal emails got subpoenaed during discovery. That's where everything collapsed. One message from a site manager literally said, "Pressure Mercer until relocation becomes unavoidable." Another discussed my failed well as increasing leverage. The courtroom got so quiet after those emails were read, you could hear papers shifting. Even the judge looked disgusted. Then came the groundwater reports, contamination maps, disposal photos, expert testimony from Curtis, and finally documentation showing Alder Ridge had quietly drafted preliminary eminent domain language claiming my property lacked reliable water access before my well had even gone dry. That little detail nearly detonated the entire defense. Denise absolutely tore into them. I still remember her standing there in that courtroom saying, "These executives didn't just damage a property. They attempted to manufacture hardship in order to force surrender." Man, you could feel the mood change right there. A week later, the ruling came down. Alder Ridge was ordered to remove all contaminated material, restore the damaged drainage systems, fund long-term environmental monitoring, reimburse my legal fees, and pay substantial penalties for groundwater violations. They were also barred from any purchase attempt involving my land for 5 years. Cleanup alone cost them millions by the time everything finished. Investors fled. Executives resigned. Gavin disappeared from the company entirely about 2 months later. Some people say he landed another development job in Texas. Others say lawsuits buried him financially. Honestly, I don't know, and I don't spend much time wondering anymore. Because about 6 months after the ruling, right around early spring, I walked out behind the shed one cold morning and heard something I hadn't heard in nearly a year. Water moving through the pipes. I turned the faucet handle slowly, almost afraid to hope, and clear cold water came rushing out like nothing had ever happened. I just stood there laughing like an idiot with freezing water running over my hands while Rufus barked his fool head off beside me. Funny thing is, the development eventually did get finished. Smaller version, different management, fewer homes. These days, if you drive through Belhaven Heights, you'll see neat sidewalks, decorative mailboxes, little trees planted every 20 feet like soldiers standing at attention. And right in the middle of all of it sits my old farmhouse with the rusty tin roof still popping during rainstorms. Sometimes new residents slow down while driving past and stare at it like it's some kind of historical landmark they accidentally built around. Maybe it is. Or maybe it's just proof that not everything old has to disappear for something new to exist. I don't know. But I will say this, there are people in the comments right now who probably think I held the town back. And there are probably others who think I didn't go far enough. So tell me honestly, if somebody offered enough money for your family land, would you eventually walk away? Or are some things worth fighting for no matter what it costs? And if you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and stick around. Because trust me, small towns hide a whole lot more secrets than people realize.